Hello guys, so in here we are going to give you a presentation about plot and point of view about Intrepreter of Maladies by Jumpa Lahiri. But before we jump into the presentation, we would like to introduce ourselves. So here are our names and our student number. Plot is a literary term used to describe the events that make up a story or the main part of a story. The plot Intrepreter of Maladies is when an Indian American family went to a family trip to the Sun Temple at Kanarak and hired Mr. Kapasi as their tour guide. On the way to the Sun Temple, Mr. Kapasi told them that he had another job as interpreter for a doctor. Mr. Das are interested with Mr. Kapasi's job and said that it was romantic. He never thought of his job in such a complimentary terms. His job reminded his wife of the son that she lost. Mr. Kapasi felt flattered from what Mrs. Das said and started to be interested in Mrs. Das. When they were visiting hills at Undayagiri and Kandigiri, Mrs. Das, who stayed at the car with Mr. Kapasi, told him about her secret and her miserable marriage life. Next is exposition. Exposition is a literary device used to introduce background information about events, settings, characters, or other elements of a work to the audience or readers. The exposition of this story is at the beginning of the trip, where Mr. Kapasi started to work as a tour guide for Das family. Next is rising action. Rising action is a series of relevant incidents that create suspense, interest, and tension in a narrative. The rising action of this story is when Mr. Kapasi told them about his other job as interpreter, and then Mr. Das found it interesting and said that his job was romantic. And then Mr. Kapasi felt flattered by what she said and began to like Mrs. Das. And he started imagining to have a relationship with Mrs. Das.
After the rising action, there is climax, the moment of the greatest tension. Mrs. Das decided to wait at the car with Mr. Kapasi. Mrs. Das told Mr. Kapasi about her miserable marriage life and her secret that her son Bobby was not her husband's biological son. She told Mr. Kapasi that she felt terrible and she needed Mr. Kapasi's advice. The next is falling action. An interpreter of Maladies, the following action is Mrs. Das joined with her family and left Mr. Kapasi at the car. Her son Bobby was missing. After Bobby was found, Bobby was surrounded by a group of monkeys. Das family got panic and asked Mr. Kapasi for help. Then Mr. Kapasi helped Bobby. Resolution: the untying of the knot. After Mr. Kapasi helped Bobby from a group of monkeys, they decided to go back to the hotel. Next, we will discuss about the plot techniques. Interpreter of Maladies use flashback as its plot technique. The flashback that we can see in Interpreter of Maladies are: first, Mr. Kapasi's dream of being an interpreter for diplomats and how Mr. Kapasi be an interpreter for a doctor. As we can see in the narrative, in his youth, he'd been a devoted scholar of foreign languages, the owner of an impressive collection of dictionaries. He had dreamed of being an interpreter for diplomats and dignitaries, resolving conflict between people and nations, settling dispute of which he alone could understand both sides. Also, in the narrative, in a series of notebooks, in the evenings before his parents settled his marriage, he had listed the common etymologies of words, and at one point in his life he was confident that he could converse, if given the opportunity, in English, French, Russian, Portuguese, and Italian, not to mention Hindi, Bengali, Orisi, and Gujarati.
Also, in the dialogue, he had taken a job as an interpreter after his first son. At the age of 7, contracted typhoid. That was how he had first the acquaintance of doctor. Next is when Mrs. Das told about her marriage life and her secret affair with her husband's friend. As we can see in the dialogue, after marrying so young, she was overwhelmed by it all. Having a child so quickly, and nursing, and warming up bottles of milk, and testing their temperature against her wrist while Reg was at work. Also, in another dialogue, Bobby was conceived in the afternoon, on a sofa littered with rubber teething toys. After the friend learned that a London pharmaceutical company had hired him, while Ronnie cried to be freed from his playpen. Next is when Mrs. Dust told about her youth and her love story with Raj when they were young. As we can see in the dialogue, we married when we are still in college. We were in high school when he proposed. We went to the same college, of course. Back then, we couldn't stand the thought of being separated. Not for today, not for a minute. Next is the conflict in plot. The conflict here is man versus himself. It means Mrs. Dust versus her marriage life.
Point of view. This story uses third-person limited point of view. As we can see, the author only focuses on one character, Mr. Kapasi. The author cannot know all the thought of all the character. It can be seen from the narrative that the author only explained Mr. Kapasi's observation. When Mrs. Dash told that Mrs. Kapasi's job as an interpreter was romantic, the author described more detail about Mr. Kapasi's feeling toward Mrs. Dash, but the author does not tell the readers what exactly Mrs. Dash feels toward Mrs. Kapasi. Mr. Kapasi had a flashback to his youth, his dream, and his arranged marriage, but readers only know what happened to Mrs. Dash when she started to tell Mr. Kapasi about her secret. Mr. Dash and his children is not told in detail. In the story, the author only shows Mr. Dash as a man who is excited to take a picture everything during trip and focus on his tour guide's book. Influences on author. The author cultural background is American Indian. The setting of the story is in India. Dash's family is Indian but raised in America.
That's all, you guys, from us. This is like the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening and watching our presentation. We hope you have a great day and please stay safe. And yeah, thank you. Bye.